No, you don't understand. His asset is very large, and that makes him very difficult to walk away from. I'm not leaving him.
The most dangerous thing a person can do is love someone who has already decided what you are worth. You can be kind to them every single day. You can show up without being asked, stay without being told, and give without keeping score. And none of it will matter, not one moment of it, because in their mind, you were never the person they were staying for. You were just the person who happened to be there. Harrison Cole learned this at 48 years old, inside a $22 million estate in Atlanta, Georgia, while sitting in a wheelchair he did not need. He had built one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country from nothing. He had outlasted business partners who tried to bury him, survived financial storms that ended other men's careers, and constructed a life that most people would spend their entire existence dreaming about. And yet the one thing he could not build, the one thing all that money and all that strategy could not manufacture, was the certainty that the woman wearing his ring actually loved the man and not the empire. So he did something that no one who knew him saw coming. He stopped walking. He climbed into a wheelchair, closed the door to his world, and waited for the truth to reveal itself on its own terms. What happened inside that house over the next 35 days would shatter an engagement, expose a woman who had spent 14 months building the performance of her life, and quietly, without announcement or fanfare, placed the heart of a billionaire in the hands of the one person he had been overlooking every single morning for 6 years. To understand why Harrison Cole did what he did, you have to understand what kind of man he was before any of this began, because this story is not about a rich man with too much time and too little trust. It is about a man who had learned, through genuine loss, genuine betrayal, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who want something from you, that the higher you climb, the harder it becomes to tell who is climbing with you and who is just holding onto the rope. Harrison had been burned before. He had given real trust to a business partner who sold proprietary information to a competitor and smiled at him across a conference table the morning it happened. He had loved a woman in his late 30s who left during a difficult quarter and later told a mutual friend that she had seen the signs early and had simply been waiting to confirm them before she made her exit. He had watched investors call him visionary in the good years and question his judgment in the same breath during the hard ones. None of these things broke him, but they changed him, the way sustained heat changes metal, not destroying the structure, but altering what it takes to bend it. By the time Vivienne Cross entered his life, Harrison Cole had developed what his father Bernard once called a very expensive kind of loneliness. He had everything the world says a man should want, and he was deeply unsure whether any of the people closest to him were there for reasons that had anything to do with who he actually was. Vivienne arrived at a charity dinner 2 years before the proposal, seated 3 chairs down from him, laughing with a freedom that he found genuinely disarming. He noticed her the way perceptive people notice things, not all at once, but in accumulating detail. She was warm. She was funny. She could talk about things that had nothing to do with money, which Harrison valued more than most of the people around him understood. He proposed after a year. He chose a private dinner because he specifically did not want cameras, did not want an announcement prepared in advance, did not want anything that felt like a performance. Just the two of them, and a ring his mother had helped him select. He told himself the question in the back of his mind was just old scar tissue speaking. He told himself he had found something real. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either, and that gap, that small, persistent, 3 in the morning gap between what he wanted to believe and what he could not stop noticing, was the thing that eventually put him in a wheelchair. Here are the questions this story is going to answer. Why would a man worth $4.3 billion fake a medical crisis inside his own home and spend over a month in a wheelchair he did not need? What did Vivienne Cross say and do during those 35 days when she believed the stakes had permanently changed? And how does Clara Mae Simmons, the woman who had been folding his linens and bringing his morning tea for 6 years without a word of what she felt, end up being the most important person in a story she did not even know she was part of? Stay with me. Every single answer is coming, and none of them will arrive in the order you are expecting. Harrison Cole was born and raised on the east side of Macon, Georgia, in a neighborhood where ambition was viewed with a mixture of admiration and suspicion depending entirely on who you asked. His father, Bernard Cole, drove a delivery truck for 30 years, woke before the sun every morning of his working life, and came home in the evenings with the particular quiet dignity of a man who had chosen not to be diminished by circumstances that would have diminished a lesser person. His mother worked a textile plant until her knees gave out at 51, and even after that she found ways to be useful, ways to contribute, ways to fill whatever room she was in with something that made the people around her feel steadier. Harrison watched both of them with the focused attention of a child who understood, without being told, that he was receiving an education far more important than anything happening in a classroom. He learned that character was not what you performed when people were watching. It was what you defaulted to when no one was. He took that lesson into every room he ever entered for the rest of his life. He graduated top of his class at Morehouse, turned down a corporate law track that would have been the expected next step, and spent his early 20s raising seed money from anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear his pitch. By 31, Cole Meridian Group had its first 9-figure exit. By 40, Harrison Cole's name appeared in sentences alongside words like visionary and titan, and he had learned to accept that language without believing too much of it, because the men who believed too much of it were the ones who stopped being careful. He remained careful. He remained precise. And he remained, underneath all of it, a man from Macon who had never fully shaken the awareness that everything could be taken, because he had watched people he loved have things taken from them, and the memory of that had never stopped doing its quiet work on him. Vivienne Cross was, by every external measure, the kind of woman who looked like the right answer. She was 38 when they met, polished in the way of someone who had spent years curating a public self, warm enough in private settings to make the curation invisible, and possessed of a social intelligence that Harrison, who studied people professionally, genuinely respected. She understood rooms. She understood timing. She understood that the most effective way to make a powerful man feel seen is not to flatter him about his power, but to ask him about the things that exist outside of it. She did this well. Harrison noticed the skill without immediately identifying it as a skill. He told himself it was authenticity. He wanted it to be authenticity. Over 14 months of engagement, he had accumulated small observations that complicated that reading. The ease with which she navigated conversations about his assets, the way her availability shifted subtly depending on how his most recent quarter had performed, the single moment in which she had referred to Clara May as the help in a tone that carried no particular awareness that this choice of language said something significant about her. He had noticed. He always noticed. He had simply not yet decided what to do with what he noticed. Dr. Elaine Foster had been Harrison's physician for 11 years, and in the way of good doctors who see the same patient across a decade of real life, she knew him in dimensions that most people in his circle did not. She knew that the confidence he projected in professional settings was genuine, but that it existed alongside a private uncertainty about people and trust that he had never fully resolved. She knew that he had been hurt before in ways he did not advertise. And she knew, during a routine check-in in which he spoke with unusual candor about his fears regarding the engagement, that he was not simply anxious in the ordinary way of a man approaching a major commitment. He was afraid of a specific thing. He was afraid of building the final wall of his life around the wrong person. She leaned back in her chair and told him something he would repeat to himself for 3 weeks afterward. "If you want to know who someone is," she said, "remove the things they came for and watch what is left." He drove home from that appointment and sat in his study until midnight. Then he called her back and asked a single question. She answered it, and the plan began. Now, Clara May Simmons, because she deserves her own introduction and not a secondary position in someone else's story. Clara May was 34 years old, the middle child of 5, raised in Augusta, Georgia in a household held together by her grandmother's cooking, her mother's faith, and the specific practical intelligence of people who do not have the luxury of falling apart when things get hard. She had wanted to be a nurse. She had started the program at Augusta University and was 2 semesters in when her mother's illness changed the plan, the way things change plans for people who do not have a safety net underneath them. She did not describe this period of her life with bitterness because bitterness, as she had watched her grandmother demonstrate over 78 years, is an expensive thing to carry and it never pays you back. She finished her CNA certification, worked hospital floors for 4 years, and came to the Cole estate through a staffing agency when she was 28. That had been 6 years ago. In those 6 years, Clara May had learned Harrison Cole's habits and preferences and daily rhythms not because she was studying him for any particular purpose, but because paying close attention to the world around her was simply how she moved through it. She knew he took his coffee black until noon. She knew he kept his mother's photograph on the shelf behind his desk, and that he dusted around it with his own hand and did not leave it to the general cleaning schedule. She knew he sat in the garden at 6 in the morning when something was weighing on him, and she had trained herself never to disturb those mornings, because some kinds of solitude are not about loneliness but about necessity. She had watched Vivienne arrive in his life and had observed, without judgment and without comment, the way the household changed in her presence. Clara May had adjusted, as she adjusted to everything, and gotten on with her work. She did not know that any of this was about to become the most important chapter of her life. It started on a Tuesday morning in October, and the first signal that something had changed was the absence of a familiar sound. Harrison Cole operated by a rhythm that the household had absorbed over years. The specific sequence of his door, his footsteps on the back stairs, the way he cleared his throat before speaking to whoever was first in the kitchen at 6:30. That Tuesday, by 7:15, none of those sounds had come. Clara May set his breakfast plate aside and kept her hands moving, the way she had learned to manage the space between what she knew and what she did not yet know. At 7:40, Dr. Elaine Foster arrived at the front door with a controlled expression that Clara May, who paid attention to faces the way some people pay attention to weather, read immediately as the kind of composure that takes effort to maintain. Clara May showed her upstairs. She did not go into the room. She did not ask questions. 20 minutes later, Dr. Foster came back downstairs and asked her, steadily and without elaboration, to ensure the household ran smoothly today. Mr. Cole had experienced a significant health event overnight. His fiancée was being contacted now. Clara May felt something shift under her feet that had nothing to do with the floor. She nodded. She went back to the kitchen. She made sure the household ran smoothly, because that was what needed doing, and she was there. What no one on staff knew, what Vivienne did not know, what the household manager Patricia did not know, what the external world would not know for 35 days, was that the health event was a construction. It had been planned with the same precision Harrison brought to every significant decision in his professional life, researched across 3 weeks with Dr. Foster's medical expertise providing the clinical architecture. They had studied the presentation of acute spinal contusion, the way the body positions itself when sensation is lost below the waist, the specific muscle behavior that reads as authentic to trained observers, the equipment and documentation that would need to exist in the room to make the picture credible. Harrison had practiced alone at night, in front of the bathroom mirror, until the stillness felt inhabited rather than performed. He had not enjoyed any of this. He was not a deceptive man by nature, and the distance between what he was doing and who he believed himself to be was a gap he could not entirely close with the justification that he was protecting himself. He knew that. He had decided the cost of not knowing was greater than the cost of what he was doing. And so the plan went into motion, with Dr. Foster as the only other person who held the full picture. Vivienne arrived at the estate by 9:15 that Tuesday morning, and Harrison, watching from his bed, noted that she was impeccably dressed. She came to the room and sat beside him and held his hand, and she cried in a way that Harrison would later tell Bernard was the most convincing performance he had ever witnessed in his personal life. Oscar level, he said, and he meant it without irony. She asked Dr. Foster the right questions in the right sequence. She searched the right terms on her phone in a way that felt organic and panicked rather than rehearsed. She called her mother from the hallway in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry through the door, and the grief in that call was complete and textured and fluent in its detail. And Harrison lay in his bed and listened and felt, for a brief and uncomfortable moment, the possibility that he was wrong about all of this. He held that possibility alongside everything he had noticed across 14 months. He held it alongside the business partner who had also been convincing. He held it alongside the woman who had also cried real-looking tears before she left. He did not close the file. He was not ready to close the file. Day 3, Vivienne told Harrison she needed air, that sitting inside the estate was suffocating her, that she needed to breathe so she could be strong for him. He said he understood. She kissed his forehead with a tenderness that registered physically and left for lunch with Dominique. Clara May brought his lunch up at noon, set the tray on the table beside him, adjusted the curtain angle so the afternoon light was not directly on his face, and asked if he needed anything else. He said no. She turned toward the door, and Harrison, in a voice that was quieter than he intended, said, "How do I look to you, Clara May?" She stopped. She turned back. She looked at him, not at the wheelchair, not at the medical equipment arranged along the far wall, but at his face, in the direct and unhurried way of someone who is actually answering a question rather than managing an impression. "You look tired, Mr. Cole," she said, "but not broken. There is a difference." She left. He stared at the closed door for a long time. He thought about the difference between tired and broken for the rest of that afternoon. Day 7. Vivienne took a phone call in the East Garden that lasted 40 minutes. Harrison's bedroom window overlooked that garden, and though he could not hear the words, he could read the body, the ease of her posture, the 2 moments she laughed during a conversation that had no logical home for laughter, the fluid, unguarded quality of her movements when she believed she was unobserved. She was not inside grief in that garden. She was inside a different kind of conversation entirely, and the ease of it told Harrison everything the words themselves would have confirmed if he had been able to hear them. He watched until the call ended. He made a note of the time. He said nothing to anyone. Day 9, he came out of his study and found Clara May 6 feet up a ladder in the upstairs hallway, focused and precise, replacing a light fixture that had been flickering for over a week. She had submitted a maintenance request. When it went unaddressed, she had gotten the ladder herself. He watched her from the doorway for a full minute before she noticed him. She apologized and said she would be out of his way in a moment. He said, "That fixture has been flickering for over a week." She said, "Yes, sir. I put in the request but figured I would just handle it." He asked why. She considered it with a small, serious frown. "Because it needed to be done," she said. "And I was here." He said thank you. She said of course, gathered her tools, and walked down the hall with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. Harrison sat in the dark of his study afterward and thought about what it meant that this was the most uncomplicated exchange he had experienced in 9 days. Day 14. 6 in the morning. Harrison had gone to the garden because he always went to the garden when something was weighing on him, and this morning the weight was considerable. Clara May came out with his tea without being asked, set it on the small iron table beside him, and turned to go. "Stay," he said. She stayed. She sat at the corner of the table, and they were quiet together for 11 minutes. Harrison counted the minutes because he had developed the habit of timing silences, measuring what people did inside them, how long they could hold shared quiet before the discomfort drove them toward unnecessary speech. Most people could not hold 90 seconds without reaching for something to fill it. Clara May sat with him for 11 minutes and offered nothing that the moment did not require. When she finally spoke, she said, "The gardenias are coming back on the south wall. I was not sure they would after the frost." Harrison looked. She was right. Small white blooms, just beginning to push through. "They are stubborn things," he said. "Most beautiful things are," she said. She took the empty cup inside. He sat in the garden until the sun was fully up and thought about what it meant to be in the presence of someone who did not require anything from the silence. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By day 18, Vivienne had begun making requests. They were small and incremental and individually explainable, which was precisely what made them significant when viewed together. Could her name be added to the household account for emergency purposes? Could her access to the East Wing be formalized in writing with the household staff? Could Patricia, the household manager, begin copying Vivienne on inventory and maintenance reports going forward? Patricia brought these requests to Clara May, who brought them to Gerald, Harrison's estate manager, a 9-year employee who had spent the 6 years before this job doing work that required him to read people and situations quickly and accurately. Gerald flagged it without drama and left a short compiled note on Harrison's nightstand. Harrison read it twice. He turned it face down on the table. He thought about a woman who had climbed a ladder to fix a light fixture because it needed doing and she was there, and he thought about the distance between that action and the actions being cataloged in Gerald's note. And he held both things in his mind until the contrast became its own kind of answer. Day 22. Dominique came to the estate for a visit, which was not unusual. Vivienne's circle moved through the house regularly, and Harrison had never restricted that access because he believed, as he had always believed, that how a person's closest relationships behave in your space tells you nearly as much about that person as their own behavior does. Clara May was changing linens in the guest suite adjacent to the sitting room, where Vivienne and Dominique had settled for the afternoon. The door was cracked the way doors sometimes are in old houses, and voices travel through cracked doors in old houses whether you want them to or not. Clara May was not listening. She was working, but she heard Dominique say, "Vivienne, you cannot spend the next 40 years pushing a man around in a chair." And she heard Vivienne laugh. A small, quiet laugh, the kind that escapes when something has been said out loud that a person has been allowing themselves to think only privately. And she heard Vivienne say, "I am not going anywhere until the paperwork is right." Clara May stood very still inside the guest suite for a moment that she would not be able to measure accurately later when she tried. Then she finished smoothing the coverlet with hands that were steadier than she expected them to be. She closed the door. She went downstairs. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking at the south garden wall where the gardenias were coming in, white and persistent against the October cold, and she did not say anything to anyone. That evening, when she brought Harrison his dinner and stood a moment longer than usual at his door, he asked, "Is there something you want to say, Clara May?" She looked at him steadily. "No, sir," she said. "I just hope you are doing all right." She left. He ate his dinner slowly and thought about what her eyes had held that her words had not released. Day 27. Gerald submitted a full report. Vivienne had made inquiries, routed through Dominique's personal attorney in a manner designed to avoid a direct, visible connection, about the financial structure of Harrison's estate in the event of a long-term disability, specifically the spousal access thresholds, the asset distribution protocols, and the legal mechanisms by which a spouse could assume authority over estate management decisions if a partner were deemed unable to direct his own affairs. These were not the questions of a woman who had made peace with a difficult future and was planning practically for what it required. These were the questions of a woman who was planning for a specific outcome and needed to understand its mechanics before committing to it. Harrison read the report in his study with the door closed. He sat with it for 2 hours without moving. Then he called Bernard, who listened in the particular silence of a man who has already understood the shape of a story from its opening sentences and is simply waiting for it to finish. Harrison told him what Gerald had found. Bernard was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, "Son, I spent 40 years driving routes. You learn real fast which roads will hold your weight and which ones just look like they will." Harrison asked if he thought this whole thing had been the right decision. Bernard said, "I think you already know what you are seeing. You are just waiting for permission to believe it." Harrison thanked him, hung up, and sat in the hallway outside his study for a long time in the wheelchair that had become, over the past 4 weeks, a strange and complicated teacher. Day 30. Something had been accumulating alongside the evidence about Vivienne, quietly and without announcing itself, and Harrison had been trying for several days to find the precise language for what it was. It was not affection, exactly, or not only that. It was more specific than affection. It was the recognition of a quality that he had not encountered in this particular form before, in this particular combination, in anyone he had ever been close to. Every morning Clara May brought his tea to the garden at exactly the right moment, which is to say she brought it at the moment he had finished needing to be alone and had not yet had to acknowledge that he wanted company. She never spoke more than the situation required. When he was carrying something heavy, and some mornings the weight of what he was doing sat on him in a way that must have been visible to anyone paying attention, she did not ask about it, did not perform concern, did not insert herself into his interior life without invitation. She simply made whatever adjustment was within her immediate reach to lighten the immediate environment, and she did it so naturally and so consistently that he had not consciously registered it as a pattern until the 30th day, when he was still enough to finally see it whole. This was a woman who paid attention to him, genuinely, precisely, without agenda, in a way that he had not been paid attention to since he was a child in his mother's house. He did not yet have words for what that meant, but he felt its weight, and it was entirely different from the weight of everything else he had been carrying. Day 33. He told Dr. Foster he was ready to end it. 33 days, not 45. He had what he needed. He was done with the performance. Dr. Foster, who was wiser than her professional manner generally advertised, asked him one question before she agreed. "Harrison," she said, "are you ending this because you have confirmed what you suspected about Vivienne, or because of something else entirely?" He did not answer right away. She waited with the patience of a woman who had spent a career in rooms with people who needed a moment before they could say the true thing. Both, he said finally. She nodded slowly. Then let us be careful, she said, about the order in which you do things. He said he understood. She said she believed him. Day 35. 6 in the morning. Harrison Cole stood up from the wheelchair in the private bathroom off his bedroom, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden for the first time in 35 days as a man who was no longer pretending. He stood there for a long time. He felt the full weight of everything the past 5 weeks had cost him and given him, and he held both without trying to collapse the distance between them, because he had learned by now that some truths are only useful if you let them be uncomfortable. Then he called Bernard. I am done, he said. Bernard was quiet. What did you find, he asked. Harrison said, everything I was afraid of, and something I was not looking for at all. Bernard, who had spent 44 years practicing love as a daily discipline rather than a feeling, understood exactly what that second sentence contained. Then you know what to do, he said simply. Harrison said he thought he did. The conversation with Vivienne happened on a Sunday morning in the study, and it was the most precisely controlled conversation Harrison Cole had conducted in a professional life built on precisely controlled conversations. He had asked her to come in. He was seated behind his desk, not in the wheelchair, in his own chair, in the posture of a man who has recovered something that cannot be measured on any clinical instrument. Vivienne's eyes moved to his legs the moment she entered the room, then to his face, then around the study with the rapid, assessing quality of a person who is recalibrating against a plan that has just encountered an obstacle. He told her everything, calmly and without cruelty, in the same measured delivery he used when he was ending a deal that had revealed itself to be built on a foundation that could not hold. He told her about the plan, about Dr. Foster, about the 35 days. He told her what Gerald had compiled, and what Dominique had said, and what Vivienne had laughed at, and what she had said in response. He placed the report on the desk between them. He gave her the time to read it. When she set it down, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You had no right." Harrison looked at her steadily. "You were correct," he said, "and you had no right to do what you were planning either. So here we are." She left the ring on the desk. She walked out of the Cole estate with her chin level and her back straight and the composed, unreadable expression of a woman who has decided that nothing which just occurred will be visible on her face. Harrison sat alone in the study for a while. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was relief. He felt something more complicated and more honest than relief. Then he pressed the intercom and waited. Clara May answered on the second buzz. "Yes, Mr. Cole," she said. "Could you bring some coffee up, please?" he said. Black. A brief pause. "Of course. Is everything? Are you all right?" Another pause. "It will be," he said. "I think it will be." She came up 5 minutes later. She set the coffee on the desk. She saw the ring immediately. A woman with her quality of attention sees everything, and she said nothing about it. She turned toward the door. "Clara May," he said. She turned back. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man who has been seeing something for years without truly seeing it, and who finds that recognition, when it finally arrives, does not feel like a revelation so much as an arriving home. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and possibly an apology, and I think a conversation." She was quiet. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He told her everything. The plan, the wheelchair, the 35 days, what he had been looking for, and what he had found instead. He watched her face receive the information in the unhurried, undefended way of someone who had not prepared for this moment because she'd had no way of knowing it was coming. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "You were testing people." He said yes. She said, "Did you test me?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "You were not something I needed to test. You were something I needed to understand." She looked down at her hands. The gardenias on the south wall were visible through the study window, white and open in the October light, exactly as stubborn as she had said they were. When she looked back up, her eyes were clear and direct and completely without calculation. "Harrison," she said, using his name without the title for the first time in 6 years, "what exactly are you saying to me?" He said, "I am saying that I spent 35 days watching people show me who they are. And you were the clearest thing I saw. What came next did not look like a fairy tale, because neither of them was that kind of person." Harrison Cole had never been a man of grand gestures. He had always believed that the truest things were said in the quietest registers, and Clara May Simmons had spent 34 years building a life that did not depend on endings that arrived on schedule. What happened instead was slow and honest and real in a way that required no amplification. He asked her to have dinner with him. Not at the estate where she had a role, and he had a role, and the architecture of their existing relationship would be present in every room. Somewhere neutral. She said she would think about it, and she meant it, and he respected that completely because he understood that she was not playing a game. She was doing what she always did, which was taking something seriously enough to give it the time it deserved. She thought about it for 4 days. She called her grandmother in Augusta on the second day, a woman of 78 who had seen enough of life to have stopped being surprised by most of it and had strong opinions about all of it. Clara May told the whole story, haltingly, trying to construct it in language that made sense. Her grandmother listened without interrupting, which was its own signal. When Clara May finished, her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, love does not always come dressed the way you expect. The question is not where it came from. The question is whether it is real." Clara May sat with that for 2 more days. She thought about 11 minutes in a garden in Gardenias. She had not expected to come back after the frost. She called Harrison on the 4th day. "Dinner," she said, "but I choose the restaurant." He laughed. A real laugh, loose and unguarded. Not the controlled social expression she had heard from him in 6 years of professional proximity, but something that lived underneath it, something that had apparently been waiting for the right invitation. "Deal," he said. She chose a Jamaican restaurant in southwest Atlanta where she had been a regular since she was 22. No press, no photographers, no one who knew the name Harrison Cole in any capacity that required anything of either of them. A booth in the back, jerk chicken, festival bread, 2 people attempting, with genuine effort and occasional awkwardness and more laughter than either had anticipated, to see each other clearly for the first time. They talked about Macon and Augusta, about his mother and her grandmother, about the things that had changed their directions and what they had built in spite of the changes, about what it felt like to be finally visible to someone after a long time of being looked past. When they walked out into the October night, Harrison stopped on the sidewalk and looked at her in the serious, unhurried way that was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight." "Thank you for the laughing," she said. "I did not know you had that in you." "There is a lot you do not know about me yet," he said. She smiled. "I suppose that is the point," she said. The story did not remain private, because these stories rarely do. The tabloids found it, as tabloids find everything, and the takes were distributed with confidence in all directions by people who had not been inside the house, and had not sat in the garden, and had not heard 11 minutes of shared silence or watched gardenias come back after a frost that should have finished them. Harrison gave one long-form interview and no others. He said, "I did something that cost me a relationship and likely some goodwill with people whose opinions I respect. I do not regret the information it gave me. I do regret that there was no cleaner way to get it. But I want to be honest about something. The test is not why I am where I am now. The test showed me what I did not want. What I wanted, I found in a garden at 6 in the morning in 11 minutes of shared silence with someone who did not know she was being observed and did not behave any differently because of it." Clara May read that paragraph at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. She set her phone down. She sat quietly for a minute. Then she texted him 3 words. "You are a mess." He replied in 4. "Your mess, though." She laughed until her eyes watered, and then called her grandmother and said she thought it might actually be real. Her grandmother said, "I know, baby. I knew when you picked the restaurant." Bernard Cole met Clara May on a Saturday afternoon 6 weeks later at the family home in Macon. He shook her hand and looked at her for a long moment with the unhurried assessment of a man who has spent 72 years earning the right to take his time. Then he said, "My son does not laugh easy. He has been laughing lately." Clara May said, "I have noticed." Bernard nodded once. "Good," he said. That was the full extent of his verdict, and it carried in its brevity the weight of everything he did not need to add. 1 year later, on a Saturday morning in October, in the garden of the Cole estate where the gardenias on the south wall were opening for the 2nd year running, Harrison Cole asked Clara May Simmons to marry him. No cameras, no announcement prepared in advance, no audience beyond the 2 of them, and the thin gold morning light that comes through in Georgia when the year is beginning its turn. She said yes. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, directly, without a single word that was not entirely meant. Before I let you go, I want to sit here with this story for just a moment longer, because the easiest thing to do with it is make it about the test. To debate whether Harrison was right or wrong, whether Vivienne got what she deserved, whether the whole thing was justified or reckless or somewhere complicated in between. But I think that conversation, as interesting as it is, misses what this story is actually about. This story is about what we overlook. Clara Mae Simmons spent 6 years in that house. 6 years of 6 o'clock mornings and correct tea temperatures and light fixtures handled because they needed handling and someone was there. 6 years of 11-minute silences that she never once filled with something false. She was not invisible because she was unworthy of being seen. She was invisible because the people around her were looking at louder things. And that is not a problem unique to billionaires in Atlanta. That is a human problem, a nearly universal one, and it is costing all of us something we may not have fully accounted for. Harrison Cole had to go very, very still to finally look in the right direction. He had to remove everything, the noise, the performance, the architecture of his ordinary life, and sit in a wheelchair in a quiet house for 35 days before he could see clearly what had been in front of him for 6 years. Most of us will never get that still. Most of us will keep moving, keep looking at the loudest thing in the room, keep mistaking presentation for substance, right up until the moment we cannot anymore. I am asking you tonight to get a little still before it comes to that. Think about who in your life you have been too busy to really see. Because the clearest love is almost always the quietest one. And the quietest ones do not wait forever. I want to hear from you before you close this out, because the comment section on this one is going to be something. Tell me, do you think what Harrison did was justified? Or did he cross a line that no outcome, however good, can make right? There is no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know where you land on it and why. And if you have ever been in a relationship where you wondered, even quietly, even for just a moment, whether the person across from you would stay if the circumstances changed, tell me about it in the comments. You do not have to use names. You do not have to give details. Just tell me if this story landed somewhere specific for you, because I think for a lot of people watching right now, it did. And those are exactly the conversations this channel exists to have. If this video reached something in you, hit that like button right now because it matters more than you probably realize for this channel's ability to keep making stories like this one. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell, because what I have coming next is going to make you put your phone down and come back when you can give it your full attention. A woman spends 22 years believing her husband died in an accident overseas. She builds a life, raises their daughter alone, and makes her peace with it. Then her daughter, now grown, takes a job at a restaurant 3 states away, and the man who trains her on her first day has her father's hands, her father's laugh, and a name she has never heard before. You are absolutely not going to want to miss that one. Until then, pay close attention to the quiet ones. They are almost always the ones who matter most. I will see you in the next video.